Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Nick Robin, the Principal Product Manager here at Vapi, and I'm here with Shalom from Cartesia. Say hey, Iz.
Hi, it's from Cartesia.
Over the next 35 minutes, we're going to dig into one of the more consequential decisions that teams building with voice AI are making right now. And that is, should you go fully integrated or open stack? And Iz and I both come with a lot of say on this topic. So really excited to have you all here and jump into the discussion. We will take questions throughout the chat or throughout the session today, and then Iz and I will kind of answer a few of the top ones at the end. So drop those into chat or use the Q&A format, and then we'll get through as many of those as we can in the last 10 minutes. So let's get into it. Iz, you want to start off? Tell us a bit more, take some time around explaining Cartesia, the history, what you guys are up to now.
Yeah, we are the company that makes models. Specifically, we do voice AI models, both text-to-speech and speech-to-text. We are known for Sonic 3, which is the best real-time voice model, PTS model. And yeah, been around for a couple of years. We're excited with about the partnership with Vapi and everything.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. And for those who don't know, Vapi is built for both enterprise and developers, a platform for building production scale voice AI agents. You can think about Vapi as the orchestration layer. So we handle that plumbing between speech recognition, language models, and voice synthesis, plus all the infrastructure around it. So that's telephony, WebRTC, optimizing for latency, and then also conversion management, making sure you know what's happening with your agents. What makes Vapi distinct is we're an open platform. So you can bring models, whichever one you want at any layer. Cartesia, obviously one of our preferred partners at the voice layer. They've been integrated with Vapi since day one. Our partnership goes way back to kind of co-hosted hackathons in basements and empty warehouses back in the day to now full first-class support for every single new Cartesia model. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like in practice for using Cartesia with Vapi. On deck today, we'll talk a little bit about kind of why voice AI architecture decisions matter and why now. Then Iz and I will open it up to just kind of a free-flowing conversation from our experience, what we've seen, what decisions you should be thinking about when you pick through models or vendors here. We'll leave you with a few pros and cons around different, whether integrated or fully open, and then answer a couple of your questions at the end. So let's jump into it. Why now? Why are you here today? Why should you care about this? Well, the voice AI market is growing quickly, and we have these two business imperatives that are starting to converge. We have operational efficiency, where voice agents are able to drive down cost or call at scale, and then customer experience. And for many, your customers, voice is still probably the preferred channel for high stakes interactions. I think what's awesome about voice agents is they're able to even further improve those interactions while maintaining a low cost per call, because you have these voice agents who are always available, they're always at their best, they're never cranky, and they can be fine-tuned and trained much easier than a fleet of human resources maybe answering your calls. And I'm sure some of you on the call today, you're maybe feeling the pressure to accelerate the performance of these metrics with voice AI. I think we've seen around the industry, we're seeing new updated company goals, leadership mandates become more agentic, more AI pilled, and that general pressure to put AI at the forefront of your business. We think voice AI is a really great solve if you're kind of responsible for owning either or both of these metrics. So what else is happening right now in the market? This chart is from Meter, and what it's doing is measuring kind of the complexity of tasks in an estimated time to complete, where AI models are able to handle them at 80% success. So if we rewind kind of back to where we started, GPT-2, GPT-3, really GPT 3.5 kicked all of this off. These models were only able to handle tasks that lasted a few minutes. In 2022, GPT-4 pushed that into kind of a handful of minutes, and by Sonnet 3.7, we were seeing 5 to 10 minutes. And I think now anybody's using Opus or O3 or any of the kind of deep thinking models, 20, 30 minutes, even up to an hour on some of these. I know I've had long running agents doing work for 45, 50 minutes. And the point in this isn't which model is winning. It's just pointing that models keep getting better. And best in class today is not going to be what is best in class 18 months. This is something we've seen play out repeatedly, and this chart is a great example of that. And kind of one of those key reasons we want to bring top of mind why locking into a specific architecture can be a pitfall in building your agentic voice solution. Now, just one more chart. I think I promised the last chart for today. This is Grand View's research on enterprise LLM market forecast. And the number that I kind of want you to focus on here is that 41.6 billion by 2033. You can see that text-to-speech and speech-to-text markets alongside this. The opportunity is even larger. One of the fastest growing categories in this is domain-specific LLMs. So we're starting to see general purpose LLMs give way in some cases for more specialized models, whether that's built around specific industries, tasks, acoustic environments when we're talking about voice. And again, that pattern is playing out at every layer, not just LLMs, but voice specific text to speech for naturalistic language, medical and legal ASR trained on domain vocabulary. As this whole area expands, we start to see things that are more and more specialized, and in some cases may make sense for your use case. So this pattern isn't new either, right? I think if we look back to kind of this cloud boom, AWS launches, opens the floodgate, everybody's thinking about building on cloud. Within a few years, there's 100 cloud providers, big and small. You start to get providers building on top of that, where you get things like Heroku and DigitalOcean. And then by 2012, 2013, 14, everything is like totally cloud native before a rapid consolidation, which leaves kind of a couple players, right? So I'm sure most of you are building on either an AWS, Azure, GCP, or some other tool that's built directly on top of those. The survivors here weren't the most feature-rich vertical solutions. They were those that had the most flexible open infrastructure. And teams that had locked into specific provider stacks often found themselves maybe stranded when that provider lost its edge. And when we look at this kind of AI boom now, I think that losing the edge is becoming now something that happens in weeks instead of maybe months or quarters, right? So, GPT-3 opens the doors, thousands of AI startups flood in, new model comes out, we start to see those who are tied to a specific model start to get squeezed out, and those that were able to kind of keep that flexible open infrastructure kind of maintain pole position here. So with that, I think we kind of look at like two ways to build here, right? There are these integrated where you have a single vendor, full stack, pre-packaged together. And this certainly has its pros, right? It's simpler, faster start, best for certain narrow use cases. And then you have that kind of best in class at each layer, right? Something that's flexible, composable, future-proof for those more complex, evolving, or multi-use case deployments. And with that, I want to kind of jump into the discussion topic for today is like, how should I be thinking about using my voice stack, right? Is my use case better suited for this one vendor full stack, or do I need to look at something best in class with full flexibility across each layer? So for that, let me bring in you, Iz, again, and let's talk a little bit about this. So just to kind of open that question, how should I be thinking about building my voice stack?
Yeah, I think you kind of summarize it well. If you're just getting started and you have very confident that your use case is relatively narrow, sometimes it's tempting to go and go ahead with a single provider, just do everything through them. Everything is kind of integrated. You can time to value might be a little shorter. So it's not that long either way, but it might be like a really quick way to get a proof of concept out there. If you're in a company that's trying to get a funding for a certain project, that might be a really easy way to do a little demo. And that's powerful. And then in some cases, very big enterprises want to kind of contract against a single company. That's another kind of use case where the integrated, we see kind of people gravitate towards integrated. And then the OpenStack modular is sort of the flip side of all of that. If you're trying to go the distance to build multiple use cases or to build for multiple languages, then it's really helpful to have the choice on every part of the stack. And kind of for the benefit of the audience, maybe it's worth talking about really quickly about like what are the three components of a voice AI stack, which is the text to speech, which is what takes a text and turns it into actually like the agent speaking, this speech to text, which hears the user and then transcribes it, and the orchestration, which is kind of where what Vapi excels at. And in each one of those, there are sometimes different best of class dependent on the usage. So if you're thinking about going the distance and building the absolute best thing out there for your users and having the flexibility to change things down the line, then modular OpenStack winds up being better.
Totally. And I know maybe some folks on the call don't have an idea of if they're going to be able to go the distance or where they're going. Or, sometimes you start with something really small and want to scale into it. I think this discussion is still super relevant for that because as you start building, you hit gold with a proof of concept. Like you said, you're starting to pitch investors. This does start to hit some ceilings with this, kind of single solution. And you'll need to start thinking at least through your roadmap. What does your kind of future infrastructure look like as you, do continue to go and scale that up. You mentioned kind of the cascade or the waterfall of like speech to text, LLM, text to speech, right? And I'm wondering like maybe just for this audience again, what are some kind of key metrics or benchmarks that people should be looking at each layer of that, or things that maybe you guys are thinking about at Cartesia?
Yeah, for sure. So for STT, I mean, the king is word error rate, right?
Hmm.
And it's just making sure that you're transcribing everything correctly. On LLM, I mean, we have so absolutely so many benchmarks, and I think that's the thing that varies most actually with between different use cases. You can use different models, different prompting strategies are good for different things. I would encourage everyone on the LLM to create their own evals and
Hmm.
to do that as opposed to taking like a basic benchmark. And then text to speech is again you can look at the word error rate, but actually the king of the hill there is what's called MOS, mean opinion score, which
Hmm.
is you look at between two different MOS or head-to-heads, or those are we found it also to be incredibly helpful to just compare one voice to another. Yeah, and then of course, like the thing that matters to us at Cartesia, and I think the Vapi also, is the latency, because no matter how natural your voice sounds, if it takes 3 seconds to respond, it's not gonna respond well. So the end-to-end latency, what's called a voice-to-voice and kind of like round-trip latency is what matters most, and it is dependent on all these components. If your speech to text doesn't do turn taking well, you're going to see it in end-to-end latency. If your text to speech is like slow and you're going to see that in latency. Um, and yeah, like those benchmarks are tracked. We see, yeah. What are the benchmarks that you're kind of like looking at when you're evaluating different providers, Nick?
Yeah, I think you nailed a lot of them, right? We use a lot of the general ones, but the biggest to me is like how this all fits together. And you mentioned it, and we had kind of talked a little bit before we got on today around like this kind of advertised latency and then observed latency. So one thing that we look at really closely is like, yes, this provider or your chain of providers may at P50 operate with this latency, but at production scale, you're really worried about that P99, right? You want to make sure that any single user is not having a turn that takes 10 seconds or 5 seconds or even 2 or 3 seconds to complete too. So I'm curious with that, like kind of how do you battle test some of your models to make sure that the advertise and observe latency are kind of as close as possible?
It's a great question. As they say, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're different. And everybody comes out with their sort of P50 latency, and which has to do, oftentimes it's kind of these cars where they get their emissions get evaluated in a very
Mhm.
certain setting,
Yeah.
and then in real life, like it ends up being a graph, right? Like a graph of latency that the people observe, and we stress test our models. So for us, it's not just an endeavor in modeling, which is of course part of it, but a really deep endeavor in inference engineering. We track it like really closely in production. What are the P90, P99s, etc. That's what we want to deliver on. And we hear it, like we hear how bad the customer experience winds up being if the P99 goes to like some crazy number. It's like the one way to look at this is like if the latency is above a certain threshold, call it 3, 4 seconds. It's as if like the agent has dropped. Like the
Yeah.
experience is so abysmal. It's like as if the agent has dropped. So we really think about that deeply and as part, equally important part as all the like MOS metrics or WER metrics, etc. Like the latency is part of the product.
Yeah, and I'm curious, besides latency, like when we talk about that being, a problem or an issue that gets exacerbated at scale, like what are some of the kind of other ceilings that folks may hit? You're in a single provider, you're ready to scale to 1 million calls a month. Like kind of what are some of the concerns that you hear come up from your customers in that situation?
Yeah, I mean there are definitely there are quite a few. Sometimes people start and they find that like okay the one component of the whole stack isn't working as well
Mm.
as they need. Like the speech to text isn't doing like medical transcription well enough, so they need a different solution. They want to go to a different provider. Sometimes we find that they want to use different languages and they have the things that work well in English don't necessarily work well in like Spanish or in like in Vietnamese, right? And you can't. It is actually surprisingly difficult to evaluate a provider on how good
Mm.
their certain language is. So, people, especially smaller companies, they don't do, like they're not going to go ahead and benchmark all 42 languages for hallucinations.
Sure.
You just get started with what you need to get started on. So that's where kind of thinking two steps ahead and retaining optionality for yourself winds being helpful because as opposed to like if you're a big company, then you might have time like an RFP process. You might have like 6 months to evaluate end to end every single vendor. When you're just getting started as a startup, you do not have that luxury. So
Yeah.
that's where optionality being matter. But like, I'm actually curious, kind of for you guys, like what do you see where people come and be like, oh, like I thought I was going to be able to go to the distance with this platform, and then they're like, all of a sudden they find something that doesn't really work.
Yeah, I think one thing it's kind of like almost the flip side of what you said, where it's like at a startup scale, it's like okay to use the most intelligent model or like the most expensive model in some cases, whether it's LLM or voice
Mm,
too, right? And then like when you scale it at production, we see customers do testing and do evals, and in some cases they'll realize like actually we get similar conversions at a just slightly less powerful or maybe a less natural voice. And they play with a lot of these levers too. So I think one thing that's interesting is, you're at your, startup scale, you're doing a couple hundred calls a month and the cost is not really a big problem. You scale that up to 100,000 or a million calls a month, and suddenly now you have a huge problem on your hands with costs, right? So I think what we see is some customers looking to like optimize some of those levers and where can they still, of course, find the most natural, highest performing agent, but at a cost that like ultimately fits their business model too. And I think, like you said, like optimizing across each layer of that stack allows them to do that. So just to give an example, like we may have some customer who will use Vapi and kind of our squads feature where you're chaining multiple agents together to have some high intelligence agents for, really critical or high complexity task, and then some lower complexity agents when it comes to, basic FAQs. What time are you opening? So we'll hand the scheduling off to something that's really, really intelligent and maybe at a higher cost. But for the basic FAQs, those can be routed to an agent that is a bit more economical for that use case. So yeah, some of the stuff that we've seen kind of over the billion or so calls that we've done. I want to maybe just change gears a little bit. We had kind of talked again in our prep around like building your voice stack integrated versus this open thing. And I think one hesitation I hear from folks about building fully open is like they lack the expertise to do it, right? Maybe they don't have the engineers who have the voice experience, or they don't, know where to start building with AI. Like, what have you seen with that, or like what may be your rebuttal to that kind of fallacy?
I think it's actually, there are providers out there, including Vapi, which allow building this in a relatively self-serve way with relatively little technical acumen. You do have to make a couple more, maybe like some things don't come as baked in by default as like a sort of fully wrapped up, but it's something that I think the bar is a lot lower than what everybody thinks, and you guys are doing everything you can to lower that bar further so that you can get to something early quickly. Um, and I would say it's you when you're just getting started, kind of the motivation. I guess like it's like the I guess what I'm trying to do is give people what is the motivation to spend that extra 2 hours today to get something started for something that doesn't provide immediate value to tomorrow. And what I would say is that like you kind of don't know what you don't know at that point in time, and it's the you from 3 months after might thank you.
Yeah, and I think one other thing too that I hear is like, maybe we don't have the experience building agents internally. And I think for that, I would just say like, get started building, right? I think we're just seeing that like agents will be the solve, whether you're using voice agents, coding agents, customer support text agents. I think like one thing is just getting started with building sys is so huge so that you can kind of build some of that expertise internally. So
100%, 100%.
cool. We've kind of talked about like differences in LLMs and we talked about some of the description, but what about like the text to speech side of things. And we know that not all text-to-speech models are optimized necessarily for the same thing. Where do you see teams making the wrong or hesitating on model choice, and what does that like kind of end up costing them?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get swayed by the benchmark sometimes. People look at like, there are different arenas out there and people look at, oh, that's the best one, and they just like, let me just use this. Or that's the one that I've heard about, let me just go ahead and use that one. Which, works fine at the beginning. But then there's all these other things that we've discussed. Well, what's the latency? What's the breadth of choice around voices? What is the stability? Somebody in chat mentioned like hallucinations. It's actually like, especially if if you go to as you go to more esoteric languages or like more not even like super tail languages, but Portuguese.
Yep.
If, as you're going to those, it's another thing to think about. Like, what is the multilingual performance? What again? Latency, multilingual performance, domain-specific performance. How can you do the proper pronunciation across different domains? All are things that need to be kind of considered, and of course, you want to make an initial decision quickly and move forward, but it's we see people kind of come in to swap their TTS providers based on these things. And of course, as you mentioned, cost. What's good for a proof of concept and good to get you to like a seed or Series A. As you start scaling,
Yeah.
where the cogs don't matter as much. As you start scaling, you have to start thinking about, especially in longer running calls, like how much you want to be paying.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the different languages there. Like, what are your guys' perspective on like different languages or like different models by language or using general purpose models? Like, how do you guys at Cartesia think about building support for language?
Yeah, so we're very big on multilingual. We think kind of not just a lot of this industry ends up being very US centric. We take a different kind of lens at the world. We know that there is 1.5 billion people in
Mhm.
India who speak 22 different languages, and that's one place we have affinity to. But just
Yeah,
generally, we find that these more tail languages, and they're only tail languages in sense that there aren't existing models. There's a ton of speakers around there.
yeah,
We
right.
believe that they need to be served really, really well. What we find is that the performance of a model in one language provides very, very little guarantee
Mhm.
in the performance of the model in another language. So we are like you almost have to evaluate it as two separate models. So almost on every on every language, it needs its own evaluations and everything.
Mhm.
And we find that it's quite hard to trust any provider really without you having evaluated it or without
Yeah.
having like very, very deep track record. So that's it's hard news, but
Yeah.
that's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I look at this or I'll talk with customers and it'll be a really challenging problem and it's just, some of this is the reality of like the technology is still being figured out, right? And like, we've made these massive advancements in the last few years and like maybe we expect too much of it sometimes. I think I go back and forth on this. Like, should I be expecting more from my model or less? But I think like you said, some of it is just like we're figuring things out, models keep getting better, but there's still a lot of like human evaluation or human review of like the inputs and outputs to these to make sure that at production you can get comfort over using it. And certainly I know you guys have done that and you've been championing like kind of having the right harness and having the right evals. Could you talk a little bit more around that? Like what things maybe should we be evaluating for? What are like 2 to 3 must-haves before rolling this out?
Yeah, I mean, in a world where the models change so quickly, it's important that you have like really good harnesses, both for production and for the evaluations. You want to get to a point where you see there's a new model that promises to be better. Like the ideal situation, we have some sophisticated customers who are at that level, where we'll
Mhm.
tell them, "Hey, we have a new model. Give it a try." Within 24 hours, they ran the model. They know exactly if it's better or worse to their use case. They have a very tight metric on what that
Yeah.
entails. Usually, it's kind of like containment rate or something like that, and they have a very tight answer. and that just allows them to be that much faster, if they have like a really, really tight harness around all of this stuff. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, kind of the orchestration level is kind of a harness of its own. But yeah, I'm curious what you see from your side. And I know like Vapi also has like tools around
Yeah.
evaluating how well the calls went. Like, how do you see people use those tools to evaluate new models?
Yeah, I think you mentioned like containment rate is a big one. Ultimate like task success rate of like, what was the kind of user calling in for? Did they get that solved? And then like customer satisfaction is another one too, right? We want to make sure that like we're solving these problems at a lower cost per call, but we want to balance that customer experience too. We want to make sure that like we're not just totally degrading that. Your voice or your phone line is like the front door for your business for a lot of your customers. So want to make sure that as we're having those, high performing task success and as we're handling that containment rate, limiting handovers as much as we can, that we're not also having a really poor experience for the user. And one thing I think about a lot with the user experience is like the voice that they're hearing, right? So like it's so huge, like I can hear TV commercials in my head around like this is that voice of the brand for me. And I know you guys think about this a lot too, where it's like when you're picking a voice, that's going to be kind of your personality for your brand when they call in. How do you think about that in like an open versus kind of integrated way and how folks should be thinking around like their voice selection?
A great question. So one thing, there's a couple of choices that need to be made here. And one of them is, are you gonna go integrate or OpenStack, of course? And the other one is, are you gonna clone your own voices versus are you gonna use something out of box? I can tell you, from having done thousands of voices, sourcing a great voice is surprisingly difficult.
Mm,
You need to get the right voice actor. You need to get the right set of transcripts. You need to get them in the right setting. You need to record it. You need to test. You need to do post-processing, etc. All of those things. It is something that, if you're like a big company, it's definitely something that you will have to do to kind of develop your identity
yeah.
around it. If you're a smaller company, you usually want to get started from something that is out of box.
Mm,
And in that regime, like actually it's quite a big of a commitment if you think about it. You put a voice, your stakeholders, be that your customers or somebody internal, are actually kind of, they have they're bought into that voice. Besides everything else that you're doing, they're bought into that voice. And there are some platforms that, their whole model is only is available in that platform. So you can end up being in a situation where the voice locks you into the platform, which is difficult. So those are things that are all to be considered. Do you want to clone your own voice or do you want to use a prepackaged voice? Different considerations to each one of those.
sure. And like again, I'll use my TV commercial example. Like when they kill off the main speaker of a brand, you know what I mean? Like suddenly Jake from State Farm's gone. It's like, oh no, like well, where did my connection with the brand go? And I think the same thing can be said on voice. I want to just kind of get one or two more questions to you before we head over to Q&A. You mentioned voice cloning, and certainly like we've done some of that. We've done some of that with you. We've had some customers or many customers, I guess I should say, do it kind of between the two of us. But like, if I'm a customer or if I'm a brand right now and I want to like get started with voice cloning, like you mentioned specific transcript, finding the right voice, like what are some questions I should be asking or how should I be getting prepared for that?
Yeah, let me actually address the most common misconception
Yeah.
about it because we think about kind of when you think about voice, people think about like, oh, like if I record 10 seconds of myself, that I can just kind of clone myself and speak in
Mhm.
all different kind of situations. The reality is that with these models, it's not just the timbre of your voice and how it sounds, but it's also how you speak. So
Mm.
obviously in a webinar setting, we're speak it differently than this is actually like a conversational thing, but in a presentation you speak differently. Imagine kind of like a coach's halftime speech. There is a ton of like ethos to it. Like it speaks in a very certain way as
Yeah.
opposed to reading out some words. And all of those, like what we call like prosody characteristics that you do as you clone the voice, are going to carry over into the voice. So the voice is not just like, oh, how it sounds to my ear. It is all these characteristics. So you have to think about all it is. Like what is the context? I remember like sitting in like in a customer contact like call center,
Mhm.
and you could hear one call center person was, we've heard him like speak in a call center setting, and then they got a call from family. They picked up the phone, and it's as if it was a different person. So
Mm.
those like when you have to really think about the use case and how you want it to sound in that use case specifically, and do your kind of cloning at that level. So, and again, now you're doing it in a via voice actor, so you have to actually kind of prompt them to do it really well. And we've seen like some sophisticated customer, really sophisticated strategies on how to get the voice actor to do it exactly like that because it's very non-trivial.
Interesting. Yeah. And I know one thing our customers do quite a bit of testing with the voices and like measuring conversion rate and customer satisfaction on that. It's an area that honestly, coming into this, I kind of maybe passed over or didn't fully understand the importance of like, yeah, of course, your user base is going to resonate with more than, with one voice over the other. Is there anything you see from like voice selection by use case or, anything like when you're picking a voice maybe off the rack and not cloning that customers should think about, like male versus female, picking different accents, like what works best, or is it just you have to test with your audience?
Always best test with the audience, I would say. We do see a gravitation towards female. Somebody in the chat mentioned that nailing the right, especially for female voices, it ends up being quite difficult, kind of finding the right balance between assertive and kind of like helpful. It is a tough balance. And yeah, like testing is a good idea. Like finding the set of candidates to test is always a good idea. One thing I would say is for people rather than the biggest tip I can give here is like rather than speaking to it, listening to it in like a generation over generation, like playing the play button, actually stand up an agent and talk to it. Just like on your way home,
Yeah.
set up if you're going to decide between A and B, just have like a 10-minute conversation with each one of them. We humans have our brains wired really, really well to have a conversation as opposed to pressing a play button multiple times and coming up with random transcripts.
Yeah, and I think like you'll find kind of some of the nuance in that voice, not after the first snippet of like, generated text, but like as your six, seven turns into the conversation. I want to
100%.
turn it over to Q&A here in just 1 second, but before I do that, like anything on the Cartesia side is that you want to cover any, if I'm just jumping into Cartesia, kind of what should I maybe start building with, or where should I start looking?
Yeah, I mean, Cartesia.ai, you can just get starting is free. You can take we've been experimenting with some cool stuff recently. You can always check our change log to see what we've been up to. We've been cooking for the last few months and have some exciting stuff down the pipe.
Cool, cool. Excited to hear it. So let me turn over to the Q&A. And before I do that, I want to maybe just recap a bit of this discussion that we had today. So look, there is an honest case for like when an integrated stack is going to be better, right? I think it offers these pros of like an out-of-the-box solution, very few, if not only one vendor contract to manage. You can have extreme vertical depth with like your specific use case, but you then may end up locked into a specific vendor's either model roadmap or their own models. When there's one weakness in the layer, you try to like scale that out, and you can't optimize the transcriber, or you can't swap in a multi-language, ASR. That may be a kind of signal for when it's time to upgrade into something that's a bit more open. Again, on that kind of modular side, I think some of the pros here, and this is kind of the Vapi Cartesia mix, is you're able to upgrade at any layer without having to migrate your entire stack. At each step of that cascade, again, the speech to text, LLM, text to speech, we offer that kind of best fit for each, and you're able to kind of optimize and fine tune some of those different layers. Bringing in new models as they ship, again, whenever has something exciting in the change log, it'll be there for you in Vapi. But of course, it comes with more vendors to coordinate, potentially a higher upfront architectural investment, but something that does offer a bit more durability and long lasting. So with that, let me turn it over to the Q&A. I've been trying to keep up with the questions here and monitoring them. Got a lot of exciting ones. Let me just take one look here. And I think the first one I'll talk about is the question around what role should I consider using Vapi in an OpenStack architecture? So great question. Again, when you think about Vapi, think about us as the plumbing and infrastructure behind that. speech to text, LLM, and voice, right? So pulling in all the different models together and offering you levers to pull and test different ones within your single agent building experience. So the kind of plumbing and the connection between all of those different models, whether it's something from Cartesia or whether you're using an OpenAI or an Anthropic LLM or your, transcriber of choice, making sure that you have a single place to pull all those in together and have the plumbing work. Question around, is Cartesia Sonic already built into the Vapi agents? Yes, so fully built in. I think, again, as I mentioned, Cartesia's been a kind of partner since day one of building in Vapi. So, I have hundreds of customers kind of building on top of Sonic 3 or any latest models that is in the team are cooking up there. But as I said, you can get started, bring in your API key, or just start using Vapi with that today. Just taking a look at some of the questions here. Yeah, so I mentioned Vapi squads earlier. So there's a question around explaining what Vapi squads are. What's the best model to use squads? So squads allows you to organize like a multi-agent architecture. So I think the example I mentioned is like you may have a call answering agent who routes to different agents based on specific task. In my example, again, before, you may want to optimize those agents for certain tasks and have kind of higher intelligence or higher powered models handle some more complex tasks that have a higher cost. But some, easier tasks, FAQs, basic, what time is your, business open can be handled by like a lower cost model if these, business economics are really important to you at the scale that you're operating in. Uh, cool. Let me just pop over the question. It's flooded, so I'm trying to get to as many of them as I
There's one
can.
I guess I can
Yeah,
take.
go ahead, jump in there.
What does harness mean in this context? I'd say harness, for instance, Claude Code is a harness for for Opus to do agentic coding tasks. It's the code that is around a different model to make sure that the models are doing what you want to do. And people often talk about eval harness, which is like how do you have like a certain piece of code that takes just as an input the API key, the model ID, et cetera, and runs the entire eval on it, and you can kind of swap out the model. So it's any sort of environment where you can swap out different models, and so in some extent we call it like orchestration, but they can call the agent frameworks also are kind of agent harnesses.
Yeah, great one. One thing I may have saw this in the chat, but we've of course talked about kind of the standard three-step voice pipeline. But what about speech to speech is? What are you guys kind of seeing there from a model
Oh,
standpoint?
oh, you spoke to my heart. We really do believe in speech to speech as like the long term of where this is going. I think it's gonna come actually sooner than we think. I had a prediction in a different fireside. It was that right now I would say like 95% of the voice agent calls are getting done over a cascade system. I think that's going to go by this time next year for sure. It's going to be more in the like 70%
Mm.
regime as opposed to this like overwhelming thing. And I think it's going to be slowly at first and then all of a sudden. Um, so that's kind of the future of it. Today, in contrast, we find that like it's incredibly difficult to get a control of the speech-to-speech system to actually deliver on the results that you need. And so we are like, again, it's a very, very small percentage. It's usually for things more like companion, where the
Mm.
transactional nature and the accuracy and the transcript following, etc., is doesn't matter as much. So, not something that is available for broad use, I would say, today, but definitely something to continue keep an eye out.
Yeah, that tracks with what we're seeing too. And we support some of the GPT real-time models. I think where it starts to fall apart in production is some of that tool calling. And I say fall apart. These are still insane technological developments that we've had in this. So, it does feel like we're quite close to it. But I also think we have this view that it will never be one or the other. It could probably live as a combination, right? And in certain cases, maybe you have one agent that answers the phone, speech to speech, hands off to another, or another agent's doing the work in the background and bringing it over. So will be really interesting to see how this shakes out. There's one question maybe for you here is around Cartesia Sonic model is known for low latency. What's the practical floor you're seeing in real production deployments, not just text to speech and isolation?
what's the concrete what
Kind of like the
floor?
real production deployments, like end to end. What are you seeing time there? I think this goes back to what we said is around like,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's a
Again,
multi-step process.
it really depends on the agent harness. For people who have like a really, really tight thing configured, then it can go all the way down to like a 1 second, I would say, area, or even below. Like that's people who've done it like really, really tight.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, the latency envelope includes multiple things. A big, big, big part of it is actually turn taking on the STT side, which is something that we are thinking about as well. But yeah, like only of that like second of that like 800 milliseconds, we try to contribute as little as possible to it. And
Yeah.
on like kind of the we on the P95, we try to stay under 150, etc. But you know, like our P50 is like both on P50 and P99, like we are the best of the class. So we're
Yeah.
excited about
And like we said before, it's all what happens in that full pipeline together too, right? So like that P95 is amazing, but if you've picked a, frontier model for your LLM and have six tools being called with it, of course that is going to affect the perceived latency turn by turn. But I would say we regularly see customers with, sub 1 second, sub 800 milliseconds using Sonic 3 and other providers as kind of the standard for turn latency. Let me just jump into, oh, here's a great one. Is there any floor on latency like below when a human can hardly hear, perceive any difference? I know we have thoughts on this, but what do you see is around like at what point does latency just become, yeah, like kind of
it.
irrelevant if it's sub
I think
200?
we are, I would say for truly natural conversation, I think we're actually quite far from the floor. So
Hmm.
like I have two answers. Like for natural conversation, we're actually quite far from the floor. The natural conversation, if you actually go and measure to people who are talking, what is the amount of like silence between their two speeches? It is 180 milliseconds on
Hmm.
average, end to end, and doing things like back channeling and whatnot. So like to get to truly pass the human Turing test, actually, it's quite a bit. If you want to, but if you look at it from like what's good enough from like when does it come, when does the point come where people are not willing to engage with it? I think if you have a conversation with a competent voice agent, but it takes you 2 seconds to do the round trip, I think people are forgiving enough. And that's the state of play right now. What I also predict is that as the other voice agents become better. Like it'll be a race essentially. As the others improve their voice agents and their latency, all of a sudden what was acceptable today is going to stop being acceptable from a customer standpoint.
Yeah, and sometimes the benchmark is like how better is it at solving the problem versus a human, right? And if I'm on a call with a customer support agent and it takes me 15 minutes, I may not care if my agent does it in 3 minutes, but has a 1 or 2 second turn latency. Again, some of this is around like the actual human outcomes that you're driving and just how much better are those than what the status quo was before. So, of course, like we see tons of customers optimizing and we want to optimize for that low latency and that's the kind of where the bulk of our work is done too. But I think sometimes stepping out of us as builders and us as like technologists trying to optimize everything, sometimes just like getting it right is the most important thing. And I think never want to lose sight of that either.
I think somebody asked a very simple question, which is how do I use Cartesia with Vapi? Yeah, you want to take that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just flash this last side here. So you jump into either of these platforms today. You can just hop over to dashboard of Vapi AI or just Vapi AI and kind of log in, create an account. Like I mentioned, Cartesia, one of the preferred voice providers, also offers some stuff around ASR and transcription, but I know voice is where you guys really shine. So simple drop down, pick Cartesia, pick your favorite voice from that. How do folks get started in Cartesia there is?
Yeah, the Cartesia AI, as I said, and you can be in the playground. You can get started with the API really quickly too. Pick a voice, start generating with it, and find your favorite voice and start using it.
Yeah, and I know we're running just up on time here, so I think I'll probably stop the Q&A there. We have the whole list of questions along with the actual answers, so can make sure that we review these, make sure that we either get back to you or we make it clear how to do some of this stuff in Vapi or Cartesia. But I just wanted to say thanks so much for having the chat with me today, man. I learned a lot. I hope the audience learned a lot too.
Same here, Nick. It's been a pleasure.